I thought that folks on this Zoom would be interested in how did you come to this topic? What kinds of experiences brought you to this understanding of how the credibility complex operates in our world?
So I started my career in legal practice as a prosecutor, and I handled what we now think of as the special victims cases.
Mhm.
Credibility was always central in these cases. And so, from the very beginning of my career, this was on my mind. I needed to think about what to believe and what I could prove beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors. And so I think that was sort of where the seeds of this tree that became the book really germinated. My scholarship has focused a lot on law reform and thinking about ways in which sexual violence is codified. And yet enforcement was always kind of lurking underneath questions of law reform. And I really struggled with the reality that no matter how much we could improve the laws on the books when it comes to particularly sexual assault, we still rely upon just a range of actors with vast amounts of discretion to get those laws implemented. And so whether we're talking about police officers or Title IX officers or HR personnel or judges or jurors, we really do need to think about the ways in which discretion is exercised and the biases that come into play when we exercise this discretion. And so credibility was sort of underneath all of that. And that's when I sort of decided to focus my attention on this question of who we believe and who we blame and what we care about, right around the time that the hashtag Me Too was going viral. And so that was, sort of integral to my thinking too. As we were hearing more and more stories of abuse coming to the surface, I was struck by the ways in which we still seemed really challenged by what to do about the stories. And so we were hearing more, but yet I still feel are not quite able to take those accounts and translate them into sort of meaningful accountability and meaningful change.
Yeah, that is part of what's so powerful about this book is that all the law reform we can do isn't going to get at this particular problem, and you do help us figure out how to get at this problem. So let's dig into that. So you said there's sort of two sides to this credibility complex. There's discounting the credibility of survivors of assault and abuse, and then there's inflating the credibility of accused perpetrators. So let's start on the survivor side of that equation and play that out. You talk about credibility differently than most people think about it. It's not an on-off switch. We do or we don't believe someone. It's way more complicated than that. And particularly, you put forward a three-prong definition that helps us understand how to analyze and understand how we do and don't credit people, how we discount, literally deflate or inflate the amount of credibility we give someone. Can you talk about those three facets, those three prongs of credibility and how that affects survivors?
Yeah, so we tend to focus on the question of what happened when someone comes forward. And that is the one very important dimension of credibility. What happened? Do we believe a factual claim? But there are other dimensions to credibility, and I think that those are less noticed. And in the book, I try to really develop the idea that if any one of the three claims that I'm going to describe now is dismissed, then the entirety of the claim falls. So when someone comes forward with an allegation of abuse, she says it happened. She says he or the perpetrator is to blame, and it matters. It happened. It was wrong. It matters. And if any one of those claims, again, is rejected, then the entirety of the allegation goes nowhere. So there are different mechanisms of dismissal, to be sure, but I argue in the book that they're functional equivalents, because in the end, if the survivor is not credited, the same impact is felt. And we can talk about that impact later. But I really want people to notice that it's not enough just to believe that it happened. We also have to believe that the blame falls on the perpetrator. And we have to believe that this is of importance and that the harm is worthy of our concern and our care. And so those are the three dimensions of credibility. And I should say, because you asked about the discounting side of this, that my general view is that credibility is a form of power, and we mete it out along axes of power. And so those who are going to receive the steepest credibility discounts tend to be those in our society who have the least amount of social capital, social power, prestige, and status. And gender is one of those characteristics that we should very much be thinking about when we're thinking about this power dimension of credibility. But so too is race and disability and sexual orientation and immigration status, and lots of other characteristics that we can certainly talk about. But I really want to encourage people to think a little bit differently about credibility, to think about it, along these axes of power, but also to think about credibility in this more expansive way that encompasses those three dimensions that we just talked about.
Yeah, you look at this through an intersectional lens, which is crucial to insights about power. And I want to ask you about one particular aspect of that, about how this power structure based on credibility harms the most vulnerable the most. And that is based on the way that you talk about cultural myths and stereotypes that we hold on to so tightly in our society, that for those of us who've been part of the feminist or the anti-racist project for a long time would have expected, would have washed out of our culture decades ago. But instead, they still persist, these discriminatory cultural myths and stereotypes that contribute to the discounting of the credibility of survivors who are women, who are Black women, who have immigration statuses, that have all of those kinds of impacts. Could you talk about some of those myths are, those stereotypes are, and how they operate to harm the most vulnerable?
Yes, I think a lot comes back to the stranger rape paradigm, which I think many of us feel like we've discarded, right? We understand that most sexual violence is not perpetrated by strangers, for instance, in an alley with a weapon. And yet I do think that this myth maintains its hold on popular imagination and surely on the law. And a lot flows from that. So, for instance, when a victim deviates from a perfect victim archetype that very much relates to the stranger rape paradigm, we tend to discount her credibility even more severely. So I'll give you some examples. A perfect victim would have had no contact with the perpetrator in advance of the assault. She wouldn't have been drinking with him. She wouldn't have agreed to go back, let's say, to his apartment. And let me just say, I'm using gender pronouns, recognizing fully that boys and men and non-binary folks can and are victims of sexual violence. I'm just using the pronouns that tend to map onto the most pervasive kind of sexual violence. But I did want to make that point. So if she goes back to his apartment, if she's drinking with him, if she doesn't mount a physical fight in response, if she doesn't report immediately, if her emotional affect is not what we expect to see, if the narrative is not linear, these are the kinds of characteristics that look a little bit different from what that perfect victim would do in response to a stranger rape. And so this mythology, you can sort of play it out and see how it shapes and distorts our expectations of what survivors should do, how they ought to behave, what they ought to look like. And as you point out, and as I try to surface in the book, race very much matters too in how we think about perfect victims. And so does disability, and so do these other characteristics that are imbued with social meaning.
Yeah, I wonder if you could connect that to some of the or any of the stories that we're all familiar with in the popular culture through Me Too, through the news, where those kinds of stereotypes have played out in ways that might resonate for people in a concrete way.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if we look at the high profile, let's say, trials of the Me Too era, I'm thinking about Harvey Weinstein. I'm thinking about R. Kelly. I'm thinking about Ghislaine Maxwell, right? And we look at the ways in which the survivors in those cases were cross-examined and the way they were often portrayed in the media. So even, in kind of modern times, when we think of ourselves, I think we like to think of ourselves as having really moved past a lot of this old mythology. We can still see the kind of focus on survivor behaviors, and sometimes it is explicitly victim blaming, and sometimes it's a more subtle kind of you know softer blaming. But it still looks at, for instance, a continued relationship in Weinstein between the women and Harvey Weinstein, or in the case of R. Kelly, that sort of the failure, in quotes, to come forward and report this abuse as it was ongoing. Even a focus on the dress of some of those young women, and that was true in the case of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell too. Some of these same very, very old and very familiar tropes, but they continue to surface. And I think that gets at your urgent question about why these kind of old myths are so tenacious, and why they continue to impact the ways in which we respond or don't respond to allegations of abuse.
they're baked into, you use that word, baked into the law, they're baked into our culture, they're baked into our society, often in ways that we don't even realize in ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, the question of, I'll pick one, resistance, right? It was once the case that a whole lot of physical resistance was required before someone was considered a victim in the eyes of criminal law, before somebody was able to prove herself worthy of law's protection. And so over time, those formal physical resistance requirements have dissolved for the most part. And yet we still place certain expectations on survivors for what they need to do in order to be worthy of protection. And so these resistance requirements have now become verbal resistance requirements. And with a very few number of exceptions, jurisdictions that have codified affirmative consent rules, most jurisdictions continue to require some sort of demonstration of non-consent, meaning that the legal meaning of passivity is equated with consent, that simply by virtue of being a person is consenting to sexual penetration.
Yeah, the burden on survivors shifts in nature, but remains very, very heavy. So let's shift and talk a little bit about the other side of the equation in the credibility complex, and that is what you describe as the tendency to wrongly inflate the credibility of the accused perpetrator. So can you talk a little bit about how this sort of inverse phenomenon works, how we tend to look on accused perpetrators as more credible than the circumstances might actually dictate?
Sure. And here too, we need to think about power, because what boosts credibility is going to correlate with, social status and privilege. And the most powerful men in our society are going to get the greatest inflation of their credibility. We can go back to the stranger rape paradigm and think about the kind of perpetrator that it gives rise to. he really is a monster. He's deviant. He's identifiable. He is someone who wouldn't be our neighbor, our friend, our coworker, our family member. Quite the opposite. And so what that does to our thinking is it really clouds and obscures the ordinariness of sexual abuse, not only sexual assault, but sexual harassment, all sorts of gender violation. It makes it harder for us to see that men who might have good characteristics, good qualities, who aren't, evil across the board in any way, might still do these kinds of things. And I think that there's a way in which we then are able to put a lot of distance between ourselves and the pervasiveness, the ubiquity of abuse.
It can be so very difficult to resist the temptation to say, but that he's a good guy, but he's a famous guy. He seems credible in the public eye, and yet he's doing these awful things. We want people to be a consistent monster in all circumstances, or it just doesn't feel credible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we see those examples everywhere. Every week it seems there's a new kind of vouching for credibility on the part of people who, really would have no reason to know the facts of the case, but yet there's this impulse to close ranks and to, protect those who already have some power and, again, some prestige, and this kind of halo effect of good men are just going to be good across the board.
Let's just take another minute to talk about that third facet of credibility of the credibility complex that you mentioned, which is, does it matter? And can you talk a little bit about how we tend to devalue the mattering of sexual assault, sexual harassment? I would include domestic intimate partner violence in that, those big chunks of harm, often based on gender, but not always. And why we look at does it matter so differently when we look at it from the accused perpetrator side. We worry a lot about, does this matter to the accused perpetrator that they are being held accountable? Mm-hmm. We worry less about the harm to the victim survivor. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, I think of this as a care gap. And so the idea is that we tend to be far less concerned with injury or suffering when the victim is vulnerable, is marginalized, has less power in our society. Those injuries tend to concern us much less than we are concerned with the possibility of some consequences to those who do the harm, those who perpetrate it. We orient to the pain of the powerful, and even those of us who, I think, tend to acknowledge that there is sexual violence and there is gender violence. Even so, it's so hard to get out of these cultural traps. And the law too does the same kind of devaluing of injury of certain sorts. So, some examples in the sexual harassment context, we've talked about criminal law, but the civil side of this is really important to think about too. And so what kinds of harassment rise to the level of being legally actionable? It's not just any sexual harassment, right? It's got to be severe or pervasive. And in the book, I just have example after example of what I think many or most, I hope most people would think of as being really egregious, really harmful, really injurious, and yet it doesn't cross that bar. It doesn't get recognized by law as being something worthy of redress. And that's just one example of many where you see injuries suffered by relatively vulnerable, marginalized, powerless populations being disregarded and being treated with indifference. And the way we do that in law is of course very similar to what happens outside of law in our daily lives, the ways that we respond or don't respond to the stories that we hear.
Yeah, someone just posted in the chat that this reminds her of Chanel Miller's book about her experience in the aftermath of her very violent rape by Brock Turner. So, and that seems like a perfect example of both sides of this care gap.
Yeah, I talk a lot about that case. I highly recommend the memoir. It's called Know My Name. It's an amazing book. And she talks about how everything seemed to be falling to his side when it came time for the sentence. And the judge made some comments that really suggested that this individual's potential, his future, his almost promised trajectory weighted far more heavily in the sentencing decision than everything that Chanel had suffered. And she had articulated it so powerfully and so vividly and so beautifully. And yet it just didn't really seem to sway the judge. And I think that captures a lot. I agree with the person who posted the comment.
Yeah. I want to talk about a different aspect of harm. This is, does it matter? The initial harm of the sexual assault or the sexual harassment or the intimate partner abuse. But what the credibility complex does that you document in your book is it builds an additional harm onto that initial harm. The credibility discounting itself causes harm. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the effects are on survivors who tell stories about the harms they've experienced and then face credibility discounting separate and apart from the initial harm.
Yeah, I should say that this was probably the piece of the research for the book that was most surprising to me. And maybe that's because, as a prosecutor, I was very focused on the, often excruciating, devastating harm of sexual violence. And yet when I started speaking to survivors about the aftermath of abuse over and over again, I heard from them that the aftermath was as bad as, or even worse than, the abuse itself. And then it turns out there's lots of social science research that confirms this and that shows that for so many survivors, it can be more devastating to be distrusted, blamed, or disregarded, those three dimensions of credibility, that can be just as detrimental to healing, to recovery, as the abuse itself, which I don't want to minimize, right? I mean, we all know that this can be, truly, so painful, and it can really take someone off their path. And yet to have the community or a trusted loved one or the systems in place to respond, to have those individuals and those institutions essentially siding with the perpetrator, that can have an impact that even the abuse itself does not.
In my own experience in working with survivors of intimate partner violence, I have found that that this has a cyclical ripple effect. I tell my story of abuse. I am discredited, discounted, disparaged. I then internalize that. So many, not all of us, but some of us internalize that. And that then affects the way I talk about my experience, which further undermines me. Did that come through in your interviews with survivors?
Absolutely. And I want to maybe go back to the first question you asked me about the credibility complex and what it is. And I talked about culture and I talked about law. But what I didn't say, and I think this is really important, is that the credibility complex works in advance to silence survivors. It works in advance to keep allegations from ever surfacing. And so a lot of what I talk about in the book are stories of the aftermath, stories of what happens when someone is distrusted, blamed, or disregarded. But I also, bring in the statistics on underreporting. And I connect those statistics to the notion that survivors often anticipate the devastation that will come from being dismissed. And they often, to your point, Deborah, they often internalize so many of these same discounting mechanisms that, there's so many reasons not to come forward. It's anticipation and it's internalization. And I think that these are really complicated dynamics, but they're essential to understanding what we're looking at when we try to figure out the scope of the problem and how potentially to start to solve for it.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, the how to solve for it piece, which is again a part of a critical component of your book. We know from decades of research that when people experience these kinds of harms, the abuse, harassment, sexual assault, they tend to first overwhelmingly tend to first turn to family, friends, intimates, colleagues, rather than officials. First, what advice do you have for for all of us we are all at some point, or at many points, going to hear these kinds of stories? How can we do a better job of responding so that we aren't part of this unjust discriminatory credibility complex?
This really is one of the main audiences for the book, people who are hearing allegations or will hear allegations in their daily lives. And I take very seriously what you just said, Deborah, that we are, the first responders in a really important sense, that we are the people whose responses will likely dictate whether the survivor is potentially going to make a formal report, or even if not, if there's going to be movement on the path toward healing, maybe toward justice even, or just the opposite, whether there's going to be this second assault, whether there's going to be this betrayal that ends up wreaking further devastation. And so I really want to empower the reader or the listener to take steps in their own daily lives to correct for some of these biases, for some of these misconceptions, to think a little bit differently about what it means to believe someone outside of particularly a court of law or the criminal justice system. How certain do we have to be before we act upon a belief in our daily lives? What does it mean to respond to an allegation in a way that is helpful to a survivor? These are questions that I think focusing on and trying to answer for ourselves can really help toward improving individually and ultimately collectively, right? Because cultural transformation is not going to happen overnight, and it really needs to happen person by person. So we can rewire ourselves to do better, but it starts with an awareness of all the ways in which we're unwittingly doing this credibility discounting and this credibility inflation.
Is a huge but essential project. I absolutely agree. So the last thing I just want to ask you about before we turn to the Q&A from other participants is, what about those official system actors? What about the police and the prosecutors and judges and human resource managers, those kinds of people? You talk about both ways that they could respond better, but also some alternatives to the criminal legal system that we might want to put more emphasis on and develop further. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of your ideas about those kinds of alternative responses?
Yes. I guess I'll say three things. One is that there are places in the law where the credibility discount is baked in, as you've noted. And so those are really obvious places for reform. So, throughout the book, where I sort of point out areas of doctrine or procedure where we see this downgrading of survivor credibility, if anyone wants to do law reform, there's a pretty clear roadmap that comes out of this analysis. That's one. Two, in terms of the systems, the that kind of implement these laws and the people who operate within these systems, there certainly are ways that we could improve those official responses. One example is, to encourage law enforcement officers to do trauma-informed interviewing and investigation. That's something that's happening in some jurisdictions, but certainly not all. And that's a place where you could imagine some of these misconceptions and biases being corrected. And then, to the heart of your question, I talk in the book about restorative justice, which is an appealing alternative for many survivors. And I explain why. I think I try to connect the desire for validation and vindication to restorative justice processes, which start from an acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the offender. And so in lots of ways, I think, the credibility concept can help us to better understand why restorative justice is such an attractive alternative. It doesn't put the what happened question at issue. It starts from the proposition that it happened and moves on to really ask, how can this matter? How can your harm matter? What does it look like to restore you? And so there's a story in the book that I tell about a high school student by the name of Sophia, who went through a restorative justice process when she was assaulted by a boy also in high school named Michael. And because of the ways in which their families were involved, and because a very skilled restorative justice practitioner was at the helm, she ended up coming out of this process empowered. She got what she wanted from it. She got what she needed from it. And it really is an example of how it can work when it works well. And I also, I think, offer, some cautionary notes. And I talk a little bit about some high school girls in a high school in California, out in Berkeley, who are very skeptical of their school administration's response to sexual violence allegations. And they didn't trust in any kind of restorative justice process. And they wanted something different. And they wanted something that they viewed as commensurate with the harm they suffered. They didn't see restorative justice as the answer. So if I were to take anything away from sort of this portion of the book, it is to say that there is no one size fits all answer to the question of how do we make an allegation matter and what is right for survivors. Survivors have very different views on this. And at least my approach is to center the voices of survivors in the book and to take seriously the notion that there's a range of acceptable avenues, and that we ought to make them all more fair and more just. We ought to make those formal systems respond better. We ought to make the informal systems respond better. We each need to do our part outside of any of these systems, that we owe this to survivors.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been submitted and just encourage folks to take advantage of this moment and put questions in the Q&A. One of the questions here, Deborah, is how does the idea of power differentials that you've been talking about play out in terms of the offender's targeting of victims who can be discredited, which immediately makes me think of the R. Kelly case, but so many others. Could you share a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, it's such an important question because, it turns out that, those who are most susceptible to this kind of credibility discounting are also most vulnerable to abuse. And so perpetrators often capitalize on this. Sometimes it's really explicit. I mean, I tell many stories in the book about women who were told, particularly by, in the employment context, by their harassers, you can come forward and no one's going to believe you, right? And so there's a way in which this can sometimes happen in subtle ways, and I think in ways that maybe the harasser or the abuser might not even realize, but very often this is deployed, and it's front and center, and it's very much in the interaction between the perpetrator and the victim, that credibility is very much a part of the dynamics of abuse themselves.
It connects, I think, very deeply to the gaslighting idea, don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I talk about gaslighting in the book, just to back up for a second, if we think about these three dimensions of credibility, it happened, it was wrong, it matters. And I talked earlier about how, some of these dynamics of discounting get internalized. Well, what happened is often a question that survivors ask themselves, right? And it becomes hard for many victims to trust themselves and their own experience. Look, a lot of this comes down to who has the authority to speak about their lives in ways that prompt uptake. And this question of authority is one that is really problematic for many people who are more vulnerable, more marginalized, who've never sort of been told that they have this power, that they have this expertise. And so, when we have gaslighting on the part of the perpetrator or on the part of the collective, when there are all of these messages that are being sent that maybe this wasn't really abusive, right? It comes as no surprise at all that some of those messages are received and taken on board. It's something that, I spoke to lots of therapists and psychologists for the book. And one of the things that they hear so often from their clients is, I'm just not really sure when I look back on it. I mean, we were dating, or, he's really not a bad guy. I'm just not really sure. And, survivors themselves talk to me about this. I'm thinking about one woman in particular who was abused by her doctor. And, this was an OB/GYN who, abused her over the course of several visits. And it didn't feel right to her, but it was so difficult to sort of come to the realization that this truly was abuse and that this truly was happening, and that she could trust herself enough to realize that this was crossing all sorts of lines. And it really did take a while for her to come to that point.
So that, I think, connects to another question that's been asked, which is, I would frame it as about the why didn't she leave myth that comes up in domestic violence cases in particular. And so this question is it possible to be in an abusive relationship and choose to stay in it, or does staying mean the abuse is not real? And I think that goes to this internal psychological view that you've just articulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of choice in many abusive relationships doesn't quite work, right? These are really difficult options that one is presented with. But putting that to one side, yeah, I do think that, for many survivors, there's a receptivity to the notion that disrupting the status quo is going to be really, really difficult. And so you better be absolutely sure. And even if you're absolutely sure, when you come forward, you're going to get, as one woman, put it, I think really, really well, you're going to get dragged. And so, all of this is in the mix when someone is contemplating whether to stay, whether to come forward, whether to leave, whatever that looks like. I mean, this is all so complicated and so difficult. And, frankly, I hope that the book demonstrates this really powerfully. The deck is so stacked. This deck is so stacked against someone who comes forward.
Yeah, let's talk about the deck stacking, because I think a couple of questions here go to that idea. So one is, does this idea of believing accusers over the accused, which I don't think is quite what you're saying, but that's the question, go against the principle of innocent until proven guilty? And another one is about, is this about cancel culture? Mm-hmm. Is that what you're advocating here?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll do the first question first. And I love it because it's something that I thought a lot about for the book. I have a sort of a section of the book that's on the question of belief and what it means to believe. And I point out that, belief it's not a binary. It's not like an on-off switch. It's on a continuum. And really the question that we ought to be thinking about is, how certain should we be before we act? And the answer to that question within the legal system, can be very clear. So in the criminal context, we set a very, very high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt That's how a jury has to be convinced before it can convict, and that's appropriately so. The presumption of innocence also, comes out of criminal court. It's a bedrock constitutional principle. It says that someone cannot be convicted unless and until there's that proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But those concepts, I think, are really, it's hard to transfer them outside of the criminal court context. And if we're going to do it, we should be mindful of why we're doing it and be able to justify it. The consequences that attach outside of the criminal court are very different. We're not talking about a loss of liberty. And the kind of evidence that can be marshaled to get someone past proof beyond a reasonable doubt are very different outside of criminal court. I don't have the ability to execute a search warrant on my neighbor's house as a citizen, and that's for the good. I don't have subpoena power. And so if I'm just a person trying to figure out what happens so that I can decide whether I want to support my friend, for instance, it might not make sense for me to decide that I need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And certainly the idea of presumption of innocence doesn't really work well, because the presumption of innocence can be overcome by evidence, and a victim's account is evidence, right? So if that account is credible, then that might move me off of my initial starting point, which is that, someone didn't commit abuse, right? So I think we should just sort of, one of my recommendations is that we try to think in very careful and deliberate ways about these ideas of innocence and what is evidence and how convinced must we be. Some of these concepts can be really helpful in moving our thinking forward. So that's how I would answer that question. Cancel culture, I think actually we are often thinking about lots of different things when we say the words cancel culture. But I'll just say this, my view is that our formal systems need to really improve in how they respond to allegations of abuse, in part because I want more of these allegations brought into formal systems. I believe that there's value to process. I believe that there's value to formal accountability. And I think that what we're seeing in terms of informal reporting and the rise of sort of social media in acting as a conduit for allegations, what I think the cancel culture idea gets at, these are artifacts of our failed formal systems. And I'm talking about reconfiguring our response so that more survivors are more interested in going forward through the systems that are ostensibly there to help them and to help sort through some of these allegations. That's not to say that coming forward in any particular system is going to be right for everyone, but I certainly think that the balance will shift if our systems can improve.
Another question here connects to the medical context, and it is, what should state medical boards do when they're reviewing complaints of sexual misconduct when all they have is a complaint?
Mm-hmm.
Which goes a little to the he said, she said, word on word idea here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think that the first thing to recognize, and I've alluded to this earlier, is that an allegation of abuse, an account of a person who's saying that something happened, that's evidence of a sort, right? When we style something as a he said, she said, and kind of throw up our hands and say there's nothing that can be done, that to me is not a very helpful way of thinking about this. It is certainly a way of preserving the status quo, but I think the harder questions get to, how certain do we have to be before certain consequences ensue? And so, without purporting to be an expert in the procedures that the question is getting at, I would say that, that there are ways to evaluate the truthfulness of an account and to think about investigations in more robust ways than what we tend to do. For those who are equipped to do thorough investigations, corroborative evidence can often be gathered, not always, but often. And so I'm going to talk for a second about the law enforcement context, where I am more of an expert. And I'll say that what we often see is that investigations are short-circuited and complaints are just dismissed rape kits are shelved because police officers and detectives decide at a very early stage that a complaint is not worth pursuing because it is just a he said, she said. And so, so I do think that there are ways in which we ought to be, fairly, we ought to be committed to the idea that investigations need to be complete, they need to be robust, they need to be fair, they need to be trauma informed. And then we need to think about what that standard of confidence should be set at in order for us to then move forward with a consequence. And so, all of this is complicated, and I think is a bit of a shift from how, many systems are currently approaching these questions.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a shift. I agree. One of the questions here is this: there's a lot of discussion these days about the role of victim/survivor advocates in helping survivors navigate systems that were not designed to be survivor-centered. So you've been talking a little bit about that. This person says we're seeing this model expand in the federal government for USG and other employees. And do you have any thoughts about this space? What role victim advocates, survivor advocates can play in helping to address the discriminatory impact here?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space and a really important one to watch. One way of understanding it, and I think this is embedded in the question itself, is that there are, so many places that are, designed to be sort of antithetical to the interests of survivors, or in practice are undermining their well-being. And so it seems like a very attractive model, at least in the interim, to say you've got someone who is going to help you to navigate that. I, want to be careful, because I think a longer term solution is to make those systems and those structures more friendly to survivors, more centered on survivors. But I think, there's a problem of transition here. And in this interim, as we're sort of hopefully working toward, these better, more just structures and systems, I think that this is encouraging, that this seems to be a development that is worth watching.
Absolutely. I think I'm just going to look through. I think that the rest of the questions have really been addressed in your presentation. Here's one more that I'll throw out there, Deborah, which is, what would you say to people who have not had favorable results from a Title IX case at a university, but still want to seek some form of justice? Do you have any guidance for them for places to go?
That's a really hard question, in part because I come back to, this concept of justice and what it means and what it looks like. And, from now decades of conversations with survivors, I'm convinced that it looks very different for different people. So, accountability is often a part of that. But what accountability is looks different to different people. So yeah, and so I think if I were to to sit down and talk to someone about this, I would, ask more questions about what justice is and what the hope is. Is it about validation? Is it about vindication? For some, an apology is really, really important. For some, the systems that were complicit in abuse ought to be held to some account, and that's important. There's so many different layers to the question, but I think it really raises some interesting and provocative questions about the meaning of justice and how it looks for individuals.
I know that Melissa is going to come back to wrap us up and close us out, but I just want to say before she does that, what a pleasure it is to talk to you about these ideas that are so profound to the work that I and so many others in this virtual room do, and to so many experiences that all of us have. So I am, among many, very grateful to you for exploring these concepts in such depth and in a way that's accessible to so many people across so many systems. It's a really important book. And it's been just a pleasure to talk to you today, Deborah.
Oh, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And I say that in a measured way because these are obviously extremely difficult topics. And I also want to thank those who came to the webinar today. It's not only your time, but it's also an investment in thinking about, some really emotional and some really fraught ideas. And so I'm grateful to everyone for being here. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for this incredible conversation. Professor Epstein, thank you for these incredible questions and moderation. And Professor Tuerkheimer, it's been just amazing to have you with us and give us a great overview of your book. I know that we have learned a lot, and as you said, on such sensitive topics, but also you're giving such a pedagogical way to make all these conversations accessible outside of just the legal system and the law per se. So thank you for that. Thank you for all who joined. We have recorded this conversation, so we will send you the link as soon as it's ready, as we sort of process the video. Thank you for our two interpreters today for being with us. And this week we have more programs. Actually, we have a program tonight at 7 p.m., a virtual conversation with Dr. Sami Chalk on disability politics in the Global Black Women's Health Project. So I encourage you to join that tonight. And we have also more programs throughout the month of March and in April. Thank you again for joining all of you, and to our partners for today's event, who are the DC Public Library and the Women's Center at Georgetown. We're always happy to partner with you on these, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.